a little short background. This was a Navy scuba school. The reason I went there is that submarines need divers to dive the hull and take a look for bombs or mines or, troubling things before we leave port. So, it was a little bit of a, just a lark to do that, but we knew it would be, useful for the submarine when I reported there a couple months later. I went there with my roommate. This school featured a lot of, physical training, PT, a lot of tests. It was one of those military schools where it almost seems like they want you to flunk out. Fully half of the people who start there don't finish. As an example, one of the tests that they do, they make you fill up a scuba mask and then backstroke in a pool for an hour. And the water goes back down your nose no matter what happens. And for a lot of people, their central nervous system just, completely panics when that happens. And so if you left the pool or stopped backstroking, you flunked. So we flunked a lot of people that day. The final test they had was in a 10-meter tank, a little over 30 feet deep. And they would have instructors who would be waiting in this pool, swimming around, and their job was to punch people and slap people and sabotage people. And the whole reason for that was to stress the student. As one dive instructor said, stressing the diver is important because you have to realize that this is not a pleasure dive, that bad things can happen underwater. And he described an incident where he was diving at the bottom of the Thames River outside New London, Connecticut. They were looking for something. And he swam, down the river looking for things. And all of a sudden he hit a metal wall. And he thought, well, that's kind of strange. I'll just swim up and over this, whatever this metal device is. And as he swam up, he hit another metal wall. So he thought, well, that's strange. So he went left, he hit a metal wall. He went right, he hit a metal wall. He went back the way he came and he hit a metal wall. And the average diver would panic during this and probably drown. What had happened was, without touching the edges of an opening, he managed to swim into a dumpster that had been discarded at the bottom of the river. And he had to find the opening again. But it's like so startling what happened to the guy that, having divers who can manage to get through this stress is important. So in this test, you would throw all your equipment broken down into the bottom of the pool and then jump in after it, take a big breath, and go down there and valve in your regulator and get all the water out of it. Modern scuba regulators are built with a purge mechanism where if you push a button, it gets all the water out and fills it up with air so you can breathe. So when we tossed in our regulators, if they caught you pressing that purge button, you immediately flunked. So 4 weeks of this class would go to waste. So nobody was going to press that purge button. We're just going to use our lungs to evacuate all the water out of the regulator and get it ready so that we could get the rest of our equipment on: weight belt, fins, scuba mask. And meanwhile, all the instructors are swimming around and slapping people and taking your mask off or shutting your air valve or whatever. So for every student down there, there was, for every 2 students, there was 1 dive instructor. So it was pretty crowded in that pool. There were probably 10 of us left in the class by that time. I think we started with maybe 30. So as we went through this, and I put my regulator onto my tanks and I put the regulator in my mouth, by the time I got that done, with fighting off instructors who were, slapping me and hitting me and, turning off my valve when I was turning it on, I'd probably been under about 2 minutes and I was just completely out of air. So I had blown all the water out of my regulator. It should have worked just fine. In practice sessions, it tended to be okay. But I think I got a defective regulator. And when I, completely out of air, just took in this big whooshing breath, and I just completely flooded my lungs with water. It was just, I didn't even have the ability to stop this. It just, all this cascade of water went into my lungs, and it affected my consciousness immediately. It's sort of like the upper functions of my brain kind of switched off very quickly. And I just had sort of the reptilian part of the brain. I was convulsing and jerking, and every limb was moving. My dive buddy was a Marine Corps swim instructor, so he was putting his regulator into my mouth and trying to get me to cough up the water and stop panicking, but I couldn't. I was just thrashing around. In this test, if your head comes out of the water, you flunk. So my dive instructor, is a point of principle and a point of pride, he was not going to let my head come above the surface. So with all my air gone and with this big, lung full of water, I sort of from a distance watched myself flopping and flailing, and my vision started to tunnel out until the edges of my vision were black. And then that vision sort of, got smaller and smaller until maybe it was the size of an apple, and then it got to the size of a dime, and then it was just a point of light, and then just winked out like an old-fashioned TV going off, and everything was black for a moment. And then there was light, and I'm swimming in a very well-illuminated area, and I'm looking at my dive buddy and myself from about 10 feet away. And my dive buddy is frantically trying to get me to cough out this water. He's trying to compress my lungs almost like an underwater CPR. And meanwhile, all the dive instructors had stopped paying attention to anybody else and were all gathered around me. To give you an idea about this test, they have not one, but 2 ambulances fully staffed waiting up on the deck to revive anybody who drowns. Apparently, drowning during this exercise is fairly common. They even had a name for it. They would call it seeing God. So the dive instructors, on a routine basis, nobody was panicked. They were just trying to get me away from my dive buddy. But my dive buddy was this very strong Marine, and he just kept waving them off and telling them everything was going to be okay. And meanwhile, I'm just watching this with this new sense of calm and this feeling that I had all this wisdom. It's very hard to describe, but it's sort of like when you jump into the tank as a normal human being, you've got 10 worries on your mind. How are you going to pay your bills? What's the next assignment that's coming up? Am I going to pass this test? What are my parents doing? Worrying about reporting to the next assignment on the submarine. Are things going to go okay? And then as this was happening, I realized that all those earthly worries and cares, they're all gone. There was no worry at all. I know some people experience euphoria. That didn't happen to me. I was not really euphoric, but I was just very calm. And the fact that I didn't have any worries anymore was a distinctly pleasing feeling. But the other thing was I just had this depth of understanding that I'd never felt before. It was kind of like being a chess master explaining chess to a child. You so much suddenly that I kept describing it as the whole universe suddenly made sense to me. All the mysteries that we normally proceed with, why do we live for so short a time and then die? Things like that just seemed to make sense. I had the answers. I had 1,000 answers in my head, and none of them were crowding each other out. It was just all very normal seeming. So I'm sitting there watching myself drown, or watching my body drown. And at first it was very interesting. It's kind of fascinating to watch yourself die. But after a while I was sort of losing interest. And I guess I would describe dying as it's kind of like leaving an airline seat. You look around to make sure you didn't leave your phone or your book. You've got your passport, and then you get up, you grab your stuff, you take maybe one last look at it, and then you leave, and you never really think about that airline seat again. Or checking out of a hotel, very similar process. I mean, you look around, you remember what happened in that hotel room. Maybe you pack your bags, make sure you didn't leave anything. You give it one last glance, and then you leave, and it's just not there anymore. I felt like that. I had no sentiment or sentimentality about my body, about the life that I'd led. I mean, it was just there. It was a bunch of facts. I really didn't have any emotions about it. So I was just sort of in this mood of walking away from it. But I turned around, or I felt compelled to turn around, or something turned me around, and I'm looking away from my body. And what I'm seeing is a big black dot growing from maybe the size of an apple until it was maybe 35 feet in diameter. And it was sort of funnel shaped. I guess you could describe it as the horn of plenty, I guess. And even though it was black, there was illumination inside of the maw of this tunnel. And it was as if the sides of the tunnel were made of thunderclouds. If you've ever flown in an airplane above a thunderstorm and you see that black cloud kind of lighting up from the inside from lightning, it was sort of the same effect. So in a random pattern, all these sort of interior clouds on the walls were lighting up on and off with like their interior lightning and sort of giving a sort of weak glow to the inside of the tunnel. And I felt myself moving. It was almost like the tunnel was moving toward me and I was stationary. But I turned around again to look back at my body, and it was moving away from me as well as the tank. And then I was inside this tunnel, and it was just moving with me feeling stationary and the tunnel walls moving past me. And it was maybe 30 miles an hour is what it felt like as I watched these clouds go by. And it just seemed like I was in this tunnel for a very long time. It felt like about an hour. And then, I'd gotten so far into this tunnel that where I'd started from was no longer visible. That little dot of light where the pool had been had shrunken to the point of a dot, and then it had faded out, and there was just a tunnel. And at one point, I just stopped moving, and I was just floating there, and I had the sensation that I was waiting for something, something that seemed important. And then I just had the dimmest realization at first that I could hear people talking. And it wasn't really talking like language. It wasn't words. It was not sentences. It was more thoughts, images, intentions. When people talk about telepathy, this is what it felt like. What I thought was interesting was there were probably half a dozen or seven individual beings. Each one had an individuality that came through these tunnel walls to me. They were on the other side of the tunnel wall. There was one who seemed to be in charge, sort of a dominating spirit who had this, deeper inflection or voice, as you could say. It came off as a very male spirit. Speaking to a group of maybe half a dozen of these more female, more caring, more nurturing spirits. So to my consciousness, they seemed female. And the male spirit was not very nurturing and was not harsh, but very demanding, almost like, an earthly father would be, get in there and make me proud, son, sort of attitude. And they were not talking to me. They were speaking to each other, but they were sort of watching me, I guess I could say. And it took a while to get their thoughts so that they translated themselves into my mind. But what I gathered was that the female spirits were saying that they needed to let me go all the way to the end of the tunnel to the afterlife, because the earthly life that had been chosen for me, or that I don't know, maybe I chose it, or that was unfolding, was defective, and that it was way too painful and would be crushing, and it would destroy me, and that I didn't have the capability to stand up to that, and we needed to reset the counter and start over. The male spirit was saying that was not true. He disagreed. That I needed to find the courage that had been given to me into this life, and I needed to proceed on with my life and do all the things that I was supposed to do in this life. And the females kept arguing, no, that's going to destroy him. He's not going to be able to survive all that. And then there was a projection on the wall of the tunnel where this male spirit who was in charge of this whole thing projected a view, sort of a three-dimensional movie of the things that were going to happen in my life if I were to go back to Earth and finish things. And it was, I remember some emotions I had watching this, but immediately after this whole incident ended, I had no memory of what had transpired there. I could not tell you what this movie seemed like or looked like, or what it felt like experiencing it, other than maybe a little bit of wonder. At the end of that presentation, the female spirits all concurred that it made more sense to send me back to my life, that there was a lot of meaning here, even though there was a lot of pain, but that I had a lot of things to accomplish. And so then the tunnel walls started moving back, sending me in the direction that I'd entered. This time it was moving dizzyingly fast. I mean, it was like supersonic. And even though it took me an hour to get where I was, it probably took me about 2 seconds to emerge back into the pool. And I saw my body again from maybe 10 feet away for 2 or 3 seconds. And then I slammed into it so hard that I opened my eyes and started coughing. And I looked at my dive buddy, and he was just absolutely dark purple from his regulator being in my mouth, trying to give me his air. And he was surprised that I, came back, and he was still fighting off all these instructors who were trying to get me to the surface, to the ambulance. So I took his regulator out of my mouth and I put it in his. And somehow I managed to get this broken regulator purged out with what I had in my lungs. I think I had to buddy breathe with him using his regulator a couple times to be able to get that done. But eventually the test ended. Then they got everybody out of the pool, and they made me stand at the ambulances while the corpsmen, the medics, checked me out, and they were shining flashlights in my eyes and, checking my pulse and blood pressure and everything else. And one of the medics asked me, what was my experience? Did you see God? Did you go to the other side? And I told him the experience, and he actually found it a little bit frightening. He'd never heard of anybody in their dive sessions who drowned having an experience like that. Everybody apparently went all the way to the other side, and there were meadows and mountains and flowers, a spirit in a white cape or whatever. And mine, stopping halfway while they tried to figure out what to do with me, he found that very frightening. And he literally said to me, Mr. DiMercurio, you need to change something in your life. That doesn't sound very good. So that was sort of the end of it. I passed the course and went on to the submarine force. And I kept wondering if things would be different for me after that experience.